A couple of caveats. This seminar is set up for adults. And so everything I'm going to be discussing, it's from that perspective. And just keep in mind that, current ongoing child abuse that has a lot of other implications that, I mean, we just can't fit everything into the 40 minutes that we have here today. And I think we're down to, just over 30 minutes. So, this is just going to be, I'm going to try and give you as much information as I can, but we're barely going to scrape the surface of this topic. So I just kind of want to mention that. Also, my main research is depression, anxiety, and looking toward healthy relationships and looking toward healthy lifestyle. And so I tend to focus on what do we do right, and what does that look like. So I don't have necessarily, I would never consider myself an expert in abuse. But I do think God has given us some beautiful gems that we can learn from. And there is definitely some pretty obvious information that I think will be helpful to talk about. And the third little thing that I wanted to mention before launching into this is that this subject can take us to a very vulnerable place. And it can trigger all kinds of emotions. And I want to assure you that it's really important not to minimize those. They may be uncomfortable, but it's really important to feel your feelings and then be able to articulate that and go into what's your thinking process. There is a series of tools that I want to get into, and I'm going to get to come back and talk to you because I won't have time today, but there'll be like little tidbits of it. There's some tools for empowerment that can be misunderstood as victim blaming, which is definitely not my position. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute, but I just want to express that we can take on tools to empower ourselves. That does not give rise to excusing behavior of somebody else, nor does it allow for blame and responsibility. Those are very different things. And then the last little reminder is that a relationship is between any two people. So this could be parent-child, this could be two friends, romantic, work colleagues. And so, if I tend to be sounding one way or the other, that's not my intention. Just, it can be any relationship. So the first thing is, well, what is abuse? So there's two primary definitions for abuse. One is verbal abuse, where it's language that condemns or vilifies, usually unjustly, intemperately, and angrily. And the second is physical maltreatment. And abuse can happen on a scale. There's, like a lot of things in life, there's little and there's a lot, but it has some pretty definitive traits. First of all, it's progressive. It gets worse and worse, or more frequent, or both over time. So again, start off small, just sort of like little bursts of anger, and it will escalate. It's also demeaning. It's something different about someone who has anger management problems and yelling versus this demeaning nature. And it's demeaning for both the victim and the perpetrator. They start to lose part of themselves in the process. It also creates an imbalance of power. And it sounds like a really hot word, but it's really this idea of individuality and equality in a relationship. And that has a shift when there's abuse in the relationship. It also promotes the loss of individuality for both parties, and which, kind of just mentioned. And it's really hard to have healthy Christian relationships if we start losing individuality, because that's part of what makes the experience a joy and love. We miss out on quite a bit when that happens. So abuse hurts everyone in the relationship. It even hurts those who are not in the relationship and watching it. And I would imagine some of you have seen people in toxic relationships or abusive relationships, or you suspected it, and it can be really painful for us to watch and to see that. And so A couple of things that's another thing that's really sad about abuse is victims can find it very hard to leave for various reasons, different for each person. On top of that, they tend to get judged for staying, and criticized for that. And perpetrators themselves find it very difficult to change. There's few programs out there for people who are struggling with anger, and it becomes very shameful for them to admit it. And so they tend to become more and more controlling and more blaming someone else because they don't want to take it on themselves. And it's just literally a vicious cycle for all involved. Now, there's some other really unhealthy issues in relationships, and they, may not rise to the quote unquote level of abuse, yet they're still just as harmful and sometimes even more harmful in relationships. You hear the term emotional abuse, and the idea of there's manipulation and neglect and these unchristlike character traits and behaviors that can cause some serious problems in relationships. And belittling, criticizing, ignoring, guilt trips, goading, blaming, flattery. There's a whole host of things we could package it into here. The good news is that there are some solutions for that if you're finding yourself in that role, which most of us, because none of us are perfect, will be in the role of using toxic tools. However, this topic we want to stay on is trying to empower those of you who may know about someone and even prevent being in an abusive relationship. So really want to talk a little bit about this empowerment versus blame. We all have an influence when it comes to a relationship, but that is not a responsibility to someone else's choice. And it's not your responsibility to change anyone. This is a very biblical approach. And we would look at Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turneth away wrath. And there's this truth that no man is an island. There's not like isn't like someone exists outside themselves, but the relationships start to form and can become quite an entity of their own, if you will. So it's very, there's just so much variability in human behavior and nature. Let me give you a little example of this, what I'm talking about, empowerment versus blame. So let's imagine you're at a light, okay? And you stop at the red light and the red light turns green. And you start to proceed, and all of a sudden you see someone running a red light and you stop, you hit the brakes and you avoid the accident. Oh, that was great. You avoided an accident. Now, was it your responsibility to avoid that accident? Like, what was that on you to make sure you didn't get in the accident, or was it on the other person who ran the red light? And what if you didn't see them coming? What if you started through that intersection and they slammed into you? Are you to blame for not noticing that their behavior and that they're missing? Of course not. So I think that's really, really key information here is, sometimes we are driving along and we don't notice what other people are doing. Maybe we have really optimistic, loving minds and we're not really thinking those dark places that other people might be in. And so each person is responsible for their actions only. You are never, ever to blame in any way for someone else's actions, including yelling at you, belittling you, or hitting you, ever. At the same time, there is opportunity for you in any relationship. There's three choices when we're in any relationship. The first choice is what we call the status quo, and that means just keep doing things the same way that you're doing them. So if you're in a healthy relationship, or maybe you're in a relationship at work and it's just, it is what it is, right? There's no need to go out of your way to improve it. You don't need to leave. It is what it is. So that's the status quo. That's number one. This is typically what happens. Most people stay in the status quo when it comes to relationships. The second thing is you can change, and this can be anything from leaving to getting support to learning communication tools to dealing with past abuse. Maybe you're out of the relationship now and you need to deal with toxicity that's been left your way. So there's that piece. There's number two. And the third one is leaving the relationship. So that whenever you're in a relationship, there's always these three options. And there's some biblical guidelines for navigating this. And I wish we had more time to dive into some of these. But I did put that in the discussion group guidelines. But here's just a couple. So here's a couple guidelines for you changing, for status quo, that being a Christian person. So 1 Corinthians 7:13, that says that sometimes a believer can influence an unbeliever, right? There was another example where Paul sent Onesimus back to his master to be an influence and a blessing. But there's also biblical examples for leaving a relationship. And marriage, while it was intended to be forever, was created prior to sin being in the world. Adam and Eve went through their marriage ceremony, we're told, before sin. And so it doesn't mean two people have to stay in the same house when there's someone who's unfaithful. And unfaithful can have a lot of different meanings, and I'm not going to kind of dive into all those, but we definitely have a place where there's biblical reasons for withdrawing from a relationship. Same with, I hear people talk about children should honor their father and their mother, and sometimes this is a reason why people stay in a toxic relationship. But if you think about what honor means, does that mean being subject to harm, or would honor actually mean speaking out? Right? It says, to those I love, I rebuke and chasten. So rebuking harmful behavior, speaking out, or putting a stop to it, that's actually more honoring than just, sitting and sucking it up and taking it from parents, especially as adults, taking it from our adult parents. The other thing when it comes to abusive behavior is remembering that it's not entirely what that whole person is. And it's why some women are abused for years and years, and men, and no one around them is the wiser. Nobody sees it, because the abusive partner is very skilled at hiding the abuse, and they have some good qualities. They might be good at their job. They might even be good with their kids, and they might be nice most of the time. And so people they only see the one part of them. And so it's just so multifaceted. It's really important never to judge someone else for what they might be going through. Really important piece. So let's talk about recognizing some relationship red flags. Well, here's the obvious, and I'm going to state it right out. If you are hit ever by your partner or in a relationship, this is a red flag. If they yell in a way to intimidate or to get you to change in some way, or they use language to make you feel small, these are red flags. And conversely, if you find yourself with a strong urge to hit or to try and demoralize someone else, that's a red flag for you too. Never assume it's not possible for you to commit or receive abuse. This is one of the most dangerous things, is denial. The most dangerous thing we can be in is to think everything's just okay, when it's not okay. We are all sinful creatures, and no matter how nice this person is most of the time to you, they are sinful too. And you don't know what's going on in their heart, if they've surrendered to God or not. And so it's important for these things to be out in the open and talk about them. I'm just looking at my notes. I'm looking at the time and seeing what I should skip and what I should include. I do want to talk about this piece, and that is that abuse tends to create more abuse, and unfortunately, because we tend to be more comfortable with the monster we know than the one we don't, and so quite often there's patterns of where someone will get out of a semi-controlling relationship, and then they end up in an even more controlling one, and they end up in an abusive relationship, and they themselves had been abused. Most abusers have been victims in the past, and we tend to kind of accept I don't know if accept's the right word. It's more the facing the monster we know. It's we become comfortable even though we don't like it, than the scary alternative, which might be the unknown. Um, So let's look at some more obscure red flags. And again, with any of these, this just because you come into a relationship, again, we're all sinful creatures. This is why it's a very complicated subject. You could come into a relationship and someone might have some or one of these and not be an abusive person. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we can navigate some of these more ambiguous concepts. So the first red flag is your own thoughts and feelings, right? That's the first place to start. And here's some questions you want to ask yourself, like, are you ever nervous about what you're going to say around this person? Do you ever worry you're not good enough for them? Like, you've got to put out more, you've got to be better, you've got to kind of soothe, kind of like you have to be the okay one. Do you ever feel like they're the only one that could love you? Maybe you're just so damaged. This is the best I can do because I'm so damaged. These are red flags. And what's interesting is a lot of these have not necessarily anything to do with the other person, right? I'm not saying, oh, are they saying this? Are they saying that? But this is literally what's going on for you inside. And we all have insecurities, but these get bigger and bigger, and they become very pivotal in the relationship itself. So these are relationship red flags. They can lead to problems in our own mental health and the relationship itself. Even if it doesn't escalate to the so-called level of abuse, it's still a place where we can learn some healthier ways to deal with these kind of things, behaviors and thoughts and feelings. We're going to have a lot healthier relationship. The second red flag is in the category of avoidance. Are there things you avoid? Are there specific issues that either of you avoid talking about in the relationship? Are there some past relationships that are off limits in talking about, right? Are there excuses made in order to avoid talking or doing a certain thing? Do they make excuses for you? Or is this kind of this piece of putting it under the rug, so to speak? And the third red flag is to do with conflict resolution and anger management. The truth is, I don't know of any healthy relationship anyways, I'll put it that way. I don't know of any healthy relationship where there isn't conflict. We just all agree. My husband and I have been on opposites of some very, very important topics in our lives. And I think it's really important for us to know how is this handled. The younger the relationship, the sooner to start talking about some of the topics that might be uncomfortable, but that you want to know, how do you deal with when you don't agree on things? And then how is anger handled? Is it ignored? Is it pretended it doesn't happen? Is there some pushing till the other one person gives in? Is there like, oh, we've got to just like, we've got to talk about this subject until we agree? Again, that is actually not a healthy behavior, because we don't just know two people who agree 100% of the time on 100% of the issues. Another one is blame game. So it's another way people avoid conflict or deal with anger, is they just put it on the other person. And then there's this, what they call the cycles, where there's this outburst, then forgiveness and reconciliation. I mean, that sounds like a healthy cycle, doesn't it? But it becomes its own end game, where that's where the most passion and empathy is felt, is just in this conflict cycle. And that's not healthy. So a key here is the intensity of these cycles, and then also the comfortability in being in oneself and the frequency that this happens. So what if you see a red flag? Now what? Well, the first thing is, don't ignore it. Obviously, pray. Number one, pray first of all. Secondly, think on it. Ask yourself some questions. One of them is, do I need to be in this relationship? This is a need. If I need this relationship to feel something about myself, that's a big red flag. Um, you know, God is able to fill all our needs. And so if I need this, then there's a danger in me compromising my own principles and my own individuality in order to stay in this relationship. And that's it. That's a big red flag for sure. Next, well, so part of this needing to be in relationship, some questions you can ask yourself is, am I willing to leave if God asks me to, or if need be? Like, am I willing? Am I willing to is this something where I can surrender this relationship to God? If that's a scary question, if that's like, oh, well, God would never ask, or there's some yes butting going on, this is, again, a red flag of this control that can happen. For both sides, by the way, because it can, perpetrators, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. So I don't get ahead of myself. And then talk about it. You know, when a relationship is young, it is not protected. And again, I mean, if this is, there's lots of different relationships, but I'll just take this from a romantic part of it is, you know, there's the family circle that's protected, but it's not a family circle when you're getting to know each other, when it's young, a young relationship. And talk about it with each other within the relationship, talk about it with trusted friends and family. Be mindful of yourself or the other person making excuses or defending each other instead of just listening, instead of like, you know, okay, well, here's some things we probably need to work on, right? This acceptance of your flaws and letting the flaws be out in the open. And then get expert help. If you're starting to see some of these red flags, reach out and get some expert help. So what do you do if the red flags become more frequent, more intense? We all need a line that is not negotiable. There's a line that our partner should never cross, that not just partner, but in any relationship. And I've had this experience actually, because I married young, I've had this experience more with actually other church family and colleagues at work, where there's had to be a line where it was too far. And then I had to take that to either the supervisor or, you know, we bring it to the pastor or elder and say, you know, wait a minute, there's something going on here that's pretty toxic and we need to get this out in the open and get a mediator involved. So that line is going to be different for different people, by the way. So that's something you can talk about in your discussion group. So, and of course, it will be different depending on how involved you are in this relationship already, right? Depends if it's your parent, right? Or if it's, you know, a sibling, or if it's someone you've been married to. And the plan will be different for how connected you feel with God. For example, you know, I have a lot of tools now, and now I can take on some pretty toxic people in my life, and it doesn't affect me the same. But I've been able to process. I have a good support system. I have colleagues I can bounce things off of. So I have that strong connection with the Lord. And so if I ever start feeling like, whoa, you know, I start to see the red flags, I have lots of support system to go to. If that's not the case, that's sooner rather than later. You want to cut off that kind of nip it in the bud, so to speak. If you feel you're losing yourself, your own identity, your own personality, and that's a line that we would want to make sure you're not crossing. So some signs that the other person isn't changing and growing toward a healthy relationship, because remember I said some of these, like, it is pretty ambiguous, you know, there are some of these flags, and maybe it's happening, maybe it isn't. So here's some signs that either you or the other person is not changing and growing into or the healthy relationship. So again, I'm talking to both parties here, because I think a lot of seminars cater toward victims, but I want to prevent perpetrators too. And I want to empower people who need help with anger management and feel like they too can go to the Lord, because the Lord can heal that as well. It's not incurable. So here's some signs. You or they minimize the abuse, yelling issues. Maybe we're like, remember, I'm talking on a scale here. I don't know everybody's story. I'm trying to be as broad as possible to be helpful, or deny how serious it is. You or they blame others for the behavior. Behavior is always a choice. It never can be provoked. One exception we have in the Bible is says, "Fathers, provoke not your children." Right? There is that one, where because as parents we have this authority, especially for young children, so that's actually on the other side, right? As being good role models, but we are never to blame for someone else's behavior and choices ever. And when there's that, well, you said you were going to do this and it's not fair. That's blame. You're making excuses they're making excuses for it. Actually, this is interesting one. This happens in cases of actual, partnership and especially romantic abuse, where they'll pressure the other person to go to couples counseling, because that's their way of kind of holding on. They don't want to lose. They don't want to lose their, I say, prey. In a way, that might be a little bit inflammatory of language, but pressure's never healthy. Now, if both parties mutually agree that this is in their best interest, by all means, go for it. I have lots of colleagues who do relationship and couples counseling, but it's not an excuse. Counseling is not an excuse to continue being rude or mean or abusive. And it is not an excuse to have your tentacles into somebody and making them and trying controlling them. Another one is, you owe me a chance. You committed. There's this, again, it's pressure, right? Another one is, saying they can't change, or, I can't change, they can't change. These ideas of, it's not my fault, goes back to blame. Also, a lot of sympathy gathering. An abusive person will often try to get sympathy from you, the victim themselves, children, friends, family. They're not, and it's not a matter of consoling, but it's this, they need someone to be on their side, right? They're building up, I'm right, you're wrong, this kind of sympathy. And then there's also this like expectation of exchange. Well, if I do this and you do that, these kinds of things. So, okay, I'm looking at the clock. All right, I'm glad this is a really important piece. So how to leave safely. So let's say you become increasingly aware that you're in an abusive relationship. How do you know when to leave? And that's an answer I cannot answer for you. And I'm not even going to give you on that here, because I think that's a really, I just wouldn't want it to be misunderstood in a form like this. So that's where I would say, please get expert help for your specific situation. But I will talk about a few things to kind of give you some starting point for tools on how to leave safely. So it's really important to understand, and this is for those of us who may see someone else in an abusive relationship, abuse can really escalate when the victim tries to leave. And having a safety plan is absolutely crucial. And I was going to look up the numbers and I forgot to apologize, but most homicides, it's over 50% of homicides are, unfortunately, people that know each other, and often are when someone tries to leave the relationship. And so it's just really important to have that awareness that you don't pressure someone until they have a good plan to get out, because it can go from being slapped around to homicide very quickly if they try to leave. And then we see homicides, suicides also, because sometimes the perpetrator, there's different types of abusers. It looks the same on the outside. Most people they don't know what's going on in their head. And some they feel like they couldn't live without their victim. And so they, unfortunately becomes a murder suicide because they can't live without them either. It's really some really sad stuff when it gets to escalation. So definitely recommend professional help, but I want a few things to remember. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and put these ones in the chat. Let me see here, copy. These are really, really important. So let me put this, I can get to everyone in the meeting here. Okay, so number one, you are never to blame for being mistreated, battered, hit, yelled at. ever. Never. You're never to blame for that. You are not the cause of their abusive behavior. You deserve to be treated with respect. You deserve a safe and happy life. Your children deserve a safe and happy life, and you're not alone. There are people waiting to help, complete strangers. There are whole programs, there are whole communities of people who have dedicated their lives to having shelters that are off grid, that are hidden away. And there are a lot of helps. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put this one in here as well. This is just one article, and I think they have some tips on how to find locations as well. So here are just really quickly some things to consider when making a safety plan. Know your abuser's red flags. Know when they might be getting upset. What triggers them. Not so much for you to placate, but to know what might be safe and when it may not be safe. Come up with some believable, truthful reasons for you to leave the house, both day or night, so that you can sense trouble brewing. Know your house, know where your exits are. Keep car keys on you if you live out in the country, or make sure you understand how to get out of any room that you're in. Create a code word or phrase or signal for if you have older children, friends, neighbors, coworkers, so that if they called you, you could just say this code word, and they would know to call the police for you. Also, make an escape plan. Again, this is where keeping the car fueled up, knowing where it is, making sure the driver's door is unlocked, or having a spare key somewhere. Always have a little go bag with a little bit of money, some clothing, important numbers, things like that. Have a little go bag. And you can even practice your escape route. If you have children, practice that with them as well. And then memorize a list of a couple emergency contacts in case you had to get out without your safety bag. So if you decide to stay, here's some coping mechanisms to help. Contact a domestic violence or sexual assault program in your area. They often can provide some peer counseling, give you information on safe emergency housing and other information, whether you decide to stay or leave. And start building a support system as so far as that you can get away with your partner not becoming more aggressive, but so far as possible, get involved with other people. Develop a net for yourself, a social net, and be kind to yourself. Look at your own self in a positive way and find that affirmation for yourself. I had more, but we're really running out of time, and I can definitely add the rest of what I'm saying to our next presentation, and that's how to prevent and how to keep a relationship healthy when it's young and it's not escalated to this point.
How can a young lady? What are some telltale signs, of someone who has abusive traits, even if they were to be somehow covered? How could she? What are some situations she could create? To see if she could uncover these things to observe. What are some things that you recommend a young lady can do?
And I wish it was cut and dried as easily as that. Unfortunately, I know there's different books with different suggestions, like if they're mean to pets or things like this, or if they tend to be angry people. But unfortunately, there's can be some pretty benign, even the abusers may never be triggered until after marriage, unfortunately. So there's no safe way. There's no personality type. There's many narcissists out there, for example. They're not necessarily abusive. There's controlling people out, they're not necessarily abusive. There's people who are very soft-spoken and gentle and genuine, but they can be triggered with anger, and then they become very controlling and manipulative and abusive. So unfortunately, I wish there was a cut and dried answer, but there isn't one. And it actually makes me angry when I see really cookie cutter answers in some of these books and materials that I've seen out there. because unfortunately it makes women feel, even worse about themselves because they figure, well, why didn't I see this coming? Well, you couldn't have seen it coming because it actually didn't exist before. And so unfortunately we'll talk more about relationships and having healthy communication the next time we meet. And generally speaking, the more you can talk about anything together and build that healthy relationship before making a full commitment, the less likely this is to happen, because either A, they're embracing God with you and you're both growing in grace, and God will deal with these things for you in that relationship, healthy relationship, or B, they'll pull out because if they've already have that controlling nature, they don't want anything to do with a confident, open person, someone who's very open and sharing and confident and sure of themselves. So I imagine that maybe didn't really answer your question directly, and I apologize. I wish there was a litmus strip or a blood test we could do, and unfortunately, it's human behavior is a lot more complicated.